I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. 6 days into the spring of 2021, as the pandemic still raged around him, former Wall Street Journal reporter Neil King Jr. took a walk from his home on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., all the way to Manhattan in New York City. King had had a cancer scare, lost his brother to the disease, was trying to process the political and social failings of our contemporary lives, and hit upon the walk as an instrument of rediscovery of the America he thinks we have forgotten. The 26-day, 330-mile walk resulted in a book he calls American Ramble, which comes out early April. And if you are looking for some spring renewal in your own life, you can take the journey with him via the book. Neil King was 61 when he started the walk and is the personification of classical America. Tall, white man, wiry, square-jawed, and philosophical. In my interview with King, and in the book, he talks about how a walk like this is also a journey of privilege.
'Cause I thought my worry could save you. I'd wait under the snowbank till spring if I thought the thaw would calm you. But you already got your boots on, and you changed your face. No amount of walking is gonna take you far enough away to make it okay.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Ammonite, a DC area rock trio bringing jangle and twang to local music. The songs come from their album Demolitions. Erin Frisbee on vocals and guitar, Selena Benelli on lead guitar, and Allison Sina on drums. Ammonite has played the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the T Series, and has been featured by Bandcamp, Country Queer, and several Spotify lists. Their song, Make It Okay, which you are listening to right now, climbed to the top 10 at Alt Q Radio.
Gave up every fight, 'cause I thought I couldn't live without you. Let's call it a tie because I'm tired.
In the news this week, many regular people consider American politics, and indeed all politics, to be corrupt, which is part of the explanation for the pervasive attitude that I have described as I hate politics. But it is important to note that there is corruption and there is corruption. It's one thing to say that a politician takes money to fund his re-election campaign, which when done right is allowed by the Constitution and by our laws. And to have a freezer full of ill-gotten cash from those doing business with the government. There are several actions between those two that can be seen as corruption. And two recent cases, one in Maryland government and one in Montgomery County government, illustrate not only the difference between the types of corruption, but also why accusations of corruption are so common, and yet actual persecution of corruption is rare. Roy McGrath is a Charles County Republican who rose through government and party circles to serve 2.5 months as Chief of Staff in the office of the former Republican Governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan. This was in 2020, at the height of the pandemic. He had been a Deputy Chief of Staff in the same office for 1.5 years in 2015 and 2016. In 2016, Governor Hogan appointed him as the director of a state agency, the Maryland Environmental Service. In 2020, as he was leaving the Environmental Service to return to work directly for Hogan, McGrath engineered to get $233,000 in severance pay for himself. Later, it turned out that McGrath had falsely told the board of the Maryland Environmental Service that Governor Hogan was okay with him getting the severance. McGrath resigned as Hogan's chief of staff, presumably because the governor found out about the severance pay. Since then, state and federal investigators have been looking at the circumstances and filed indictments for fraud against McGrath. Last week, Roy McGrath missed a court date in the fraud trial and has since disappeared. He is considered to be a fugitive, and the U.S. Marshal Service is now looking for him. There is already a book out on Amazon which gives McGrath's point of view on the scandal. The book's author, Ryan Cooper, which could be a pseudonym, claims to have interviewed Roy McGrath. The book claims McGrath told Governor Hogan of his intent to seek the severance pay. The federal indictment says that he did not, in fact, tell the governor. The indictment also says that McGrath forged a memo that implied Governor Hogan's agreement. The book disagrees. Given that McGrath and Hogan have broken publicly, could this lead to more visibility on the other pandemic scandal in the Hogan administration, which involved the governor's decision to buy COVID test kits from South Korea, which were later revealed to be unusable because they were missing key parts? Nothing in the book makes this connection, and there is no indication that McGrath was somehow involved in the other case. Meanwhile, in Montgomery County, in what looks like a different type of severance settlement, County Executive Mark Elrich hired termed-out former County Council member Craig Rice as a special projects manager in the office of the county executive with an annual salary of $175,000. Elrich made this appointment as part of the powers given to him in the county charter, and the Montgomery County Council approved the appointment 9-2. Only Council President Evan Glass and District 7 Council member Don Lutke voted against it. All of this makes Rice's appointment legal, and indeed it is quite common for former elected officials to find employment in government. The county's chief administrative officer is now former Maryland Senator Rich Madaleno. But creating a special position to accommodate a former elected and not having an open competition to fill it begins to go down the path to corruption. Why was the position necessary? What is Rice really going to do in the position? Would others have been better qualified to do the job? Was this some kind of sweetheart political deal? The public really does not like sweetheart deals when it comes to politics, and arrangements like the one Elrich made for Rice may be legal, especially now that it has been backed by the majority of the county council, but they are also vulnerable to accusations of corruption. Silver Spring, particularly the residents of downtown Silver Spring and its surrounding neighborhoods, are mourning the closing of Tasty Diner, a local restaurant that has existed for 80 years. The downtown Silver Spring redesign and revitalization planning, going all the way back to the late 1990s, had made special accommodations to keep Tasty Diner viable and open. But finally now, a development company has bought the diner and an adjacent parcel to build new apartment buildings. Home prices in downtown Silver Spring have exploded in the last several years, making housing increasingly unaffordable. In other housing news, Arlington County became the first Washington area jurisdiction to end exclusive single-family zoning. The county will allow 4-unit houses in all its neighborhoods now. The Arlington County Council is likely to see a big changeover in the next elections due to retirement. And a big test of this decision will be whether pro-housing candidates come back in strength or anti-zoning groups assert their political power. I'll be back with Neil King Jr., who walked 26 days covering 330 miles from Washington, D.C. to New York City.
It doesn't make it okay. That was my mistake. Thinking there was something I could say to make it all
Neil King, welcome to I Hate Politics.
It's great to be here. I enjoy it.
Congratulations on your book, and even more extraordinarily, congratulations on your walk from Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. to Manhattan.
Thank you very much. You know, I never looked at it as a physical feat. It was more of a kind of mental exercise. So when you congratulate me, it's like I'm looking for accolades that I walked over 26 days, 330 miles. But it was quite an experience. I appreciate that.
Can you talk a little bit about what led you to do this?
You know what's funny, and I'm sure you appreciate this in a variety of ways in your own experience. Crazy, kind of ludicrous ideas can enter into your head that people don't understand when you float them to them. So years ago, I was just walking outside my house and I was on my way to work or something. And I said, God, what if I just walked to New York City? Like, how would you do that? Like, how does the pedestrian fit into that landscape, between Washington, D.C. and New York City? Because we take the Acela, we take I-95, we fly to LaGuardia, whatever. And so it kind of lodged there and it just grew over time. And it became more and more of an obsession. And I spent time studying, like, how did George Washington get there from Mount Vernon when he went for his inauguration in 1792? What were the roads?
How did he?
The routes actually have not changed dramatically, but he went by horse. It took him a week. Mine took over 3 weeks. But I became more and more fascinated by the how of it, which route one would take, what what would happen if you went this way versus that way. And then, of course, I was drawn more and more into the travel logs of the many people, hundreds who had come here in the 1820s, 1830s, trying to make sense of this weird young country, promising, also a little disturbing. Really, the whole principle that I walked with was just pay attention, to think about the landscape, to think about what rivers do to a valley, to think about the traces of American history that you can watch as you go.
So as I was reading your book, I kept getting this in my head, which is Pete Seeger's This Land Is Your Land. And your book is a sort of a similar ode to, I think, the natural beauty of America.
It's funny you bring up songs because the economy and the emotional impact that music has, particularly songs, is something that I did think a lot about. And in writing the book, I kind of wanted to mimic that a little bit by and you would have seen some of the sort of shorter little bursts of where I get like a little bit lyrical or a little bit philosophical or whatever. And they're aspects, you think of Paul Simon or something like that, the Mississippi Delta and that whole album that he did. I mean, those are such great love songs to the United States and to its geology, its geography.
Based on that, do you believe that the primary source of American vigor, strength, whatever else you would like to call it, is in fact in its land?
I say as much in the book. We Americans love to applaud ourselves, literally ourselves, that we brought to this continent a set of principles, a particular spirit, a quest for freedom. And I don't deny any of those things. We did. But I do think we downplay the fact that we arrived on this continent, this extraordinary place. It was very inhabited, by the way. From the very first encounters along its shores, the people were encountering other people. And that's its own story. But those other people, it turns out, treated the land a lot better than the people who then came to inhabit it.
So I didn't grow up in the United States. And when you ask about why is the United States so special outside of the United States, one of the primary answers you get is literally about the land of plenty. You don't get answers about principle. You don't get answers about ideas. You get, that it's about land. They have all the resources that they need.
Yeah. No, you just take one feature that I think is such an extraordinary feature, and it is a feature that came to define the state of the world in many ways for decades, which was that if you sail through the Verrazano Straits under what is now the Verrazano Bridge into New York Harbor, you encounter this long island that has a river on both sides of it, is in one of the most resplendent, perfect natural harbors anywhere in the world. And it is connected by a long river, a tidal river called the Hudson, that goes all the way up into that incredibly rich farmland. And as it turns out, once they built the canal, the Erie Canal, was easily connected with the entirety of the Great Lakes, and therefore the Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio River Valley. And that in itself, those combinations of features, created the powerhouse that was and still is New York City.
You also said at some point, if I remember correctly, you said, in order to belong somewhere, you have to have a sense that you belong, or some words to that effect, right?
I talk a lot about belonging, yeah.
And it's very hard for somebody like me to do that.
I fully acknowledge that, what I did just in setting out my door and walking to New York in the way I did wouldn't be appealing to a lot of people and would be possibly not just a little bit scary, but could have cause for it being a little bit scary, right? But one of the things I found fascinating was just how much we don't precisely create the reality that we walk into, because there are preconditions that you're going to meet people that are going to have ridiculous reactions or assumptions to you based on the way that you look and the way they react. But there are ways that we really do create the reality that we walk into. And that kind of plastic quality about it in terms of like pushing that sense of belonging into, Mennonite barns and strange taverns and, asking, two Korean guys to play tennis with me when I was wandering along one afternoon in New Jersey, in one part of Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing was really interesting. But, I will also acknowledge I am a white guy of a certain age who comes off a certain way. And so my sort of natural sense of belonging is going to be a little bit wider than some other people's is going to be, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would hesitate to, for example, be walking through some of the parts that you did.
How any of us work with that kind of concept of danger, of menace, has always been an interesting thing. I went to Iraq soon after the war started there, several times actually. And every time I went, I was, of course, filled with dread about what I would encounter. And I've always been fascinated when you go to war zone places, how often you're actually surrounded by, chirping birds and all the kinds of things that you don't see from afar. And you're kind of put off. You're like, wow, I know that bad things are happening here, but they're not happening right here. And, and a lot of times in those places, everything is, there are a lot of things can be fairly fine or even benign until all of a sudden they aren't, and it's the trick of it is like balancing the benign with the sudden flash of danger or whatever. But I'm just a little suspicious or wary of predetermining any of us for ourselves that something shouldn't be done because it's too perilous or too dangerous or bad things would happen to us. Because, my experience generally is that that's not the case. And it also just limits any of us from the outset.
You spend a lot of time walking through Amish country. And the Amish, separate themselves from the rest of the world, right? And in reading the book, I saw some admiration for that separation. But I was left wondering what would happen if all of us decided to separate similarly.
Yeah, it is. It's a mix of self-sufficiency with outside commerce. And they don't spend lavish amounts of money on other things, which all of us do, consumer goods and the like. So, but that land around there is not cheap. And they, I talked to some of the people that when a farm comes up for sale, they have bidding wars between, this group of Mennonites, this group of Amish as to who's going to scoop it up. And people have a lot of capital.
You work for the Wall Street Journal, right?
Yeah.
As a business story, isn't that kind of truly amazing that you can be separated socially and integrated economically?
Yeah, I know. It's the whole thing. I think, a lot of my way that I just took throughout the whole walk was just, okay, I'm now in this place, give it its due, understand it to the best of your abilities. Of course, keep moving. I was there to keep moving. But that stretch, which was only like 2.5 days when I was walking through that part of Lancaster, but I think I devoted like 4 chapters to it because it was so, so rich and amazing in other ways. And I made these jokes, I think as you saw, they were kind of intended as jokes where I would sort of talk about the micro nations that I was going through. And I would give them kind of clever names as I went. And part of that was kind of tipping my hat to the ways that, Alexis de Tocqueville or other peoples going back to the 1820s, 30s, 40s would look at the micronations that were very much a reality at the time. But they're still like that. There really are these. You go up into northern Maryland, and by the way, when it comes to seeing a lot of Confederate flags and stuff, that was sort of the area where I saw, all that kind of thing. And, that is an area that has a distinct personality. When you go up into York County, that has a very distinct personality. When you cross, by the way, the Susquehanna from York into Lancaster counties, I would argue that's one of the more rich and dramatic river crossings in the country, because you read those two counties have very different histories, very different psychologies, even now. Um, and, there's just a prim orderliness about the Lancaster side of that river that is very striking when you look at it from the point of view of a slow moving pedestrian.
Let's talk a little bit about pedestrian safety. That's sort of important, I think, a consequence of your book. What was your experience with pedestrian infrastructure? I know it at some point you described it as um, orphan sidewalks.
Orphan sidewalks, yeah. It was so funny because you'd be walking along and some nice community board or whatever had decided, at some point, like, let's put a little sidewalk here. And it might last for like, a quarter of a mile, and then it would just stop and you would be back to walking the shoulder. This was not a Appalachian Trail hike. This was not a nature hike. The only stretch of the way that I walked, not on a road for the most part, was the rail bed that goes up from Railroad, PA, or actually even below the Maryland-Pennsylvania border, all the way up to York, which I highly recommend. That's one of the earliest railroad lines in American history.
Based on your experience, what do you think we ought to do as a public policy measure about our walking infrastructure?
It's funny. We have these assets like the Appalachian Trail, and we have actually quite a large network of these rail trails and other kind of bike trails. But I think we could make great strides in opening up more of our rural lands to walking through them in a way that isn't just sort of following some pre-existing thing. I've done a fair bit of walking in England and in other parts of Europe in particular, and they have a lot of those kinds of pathways that are really, we could definitely create almost a path, not along where I went, but some sort of, colonial that would be more interactive with the towns and less, the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Coast Trail. These other trails we have are in the, basically in kind of wildernessy areas. But I think there's real value in having paths that would connect town to town to town, and where you're paying more attention, not just to the natural splendor, but to the human story. But, ever since the car took over American life, we've really downplayed a lot of that. It's only been recently that we started to make good strides in that direction.
Having sidewalks opens those towns to people walking through, which they may or may not want.
What are the markers of a solid community-based community? I think having sidewalks is one of those primary markers. There was a transition point in American life between being a porch society and being a back deck society or a back patio society, where you drive through these little towns and they were all about the front porch, and people would go by in their carriage or later in their car or on foot, and people would interact from the front porch. You'd sit out on a summer's night, and it was about outward facing, community facing. Then all town design or all house design went to the back patio. And then we put fences up and we turn away from the commons. And, the strength of community life is built around the commons, the town square, the town park, the sidewalks. That is the strength of a community.
I feel like whether it's the Appalachian Trail or Times Square, we do pedestrian infrastructure as a destination. It's not connected to our regular lives.
I guess I'm living proof that you can walk through one of the most congested, car-heavy, people-heavy areas of the country and have a really, truly magical time doing it with very few humiliating or even remotely dangerous experiences relative to pedestrian meets car. You just have to be kind of creative about it. And for the most part, all the way into New York City, I was walking through, maybe I overstated by saying magical, but there were only a few stretches that were outright ugly, and I guess some of it is the realization that if you go about it in a deliberate way, there are beautiful byways, passages, whatever, through good parts of America. You just have to pick the right roads.
Now, you didn't walk all of it, right? You kayaked through some of it.
Well,
And one of the most impressive um, parts of your book to me was going under the turnpike, the New Jersey Turnpike, and a kayak.
that was itself just a magical episode, the way it all came together, where I'd come to finally my pedestrians encounter with the Jersey Turnpike I-95, which I'd put a lot of thought into, occurred in this little town of Cranberry, which is exit 8A off the Jersey Turnpike. Many people in that area know it as an exit. And it's a very historic town, the midway point on the postal route between New York and Philadelphia. And I had planned to walk up Cranberry Brook and get under the turnpike by foot. And then I was corrected by this old, really great woman that I met there. And she said, no, you can't do that. You don't know the river. It's too clogged with swamp, and the water occupies the entire passage under the freeway. So, but she came up with another idea, and her son then showed up and said, I've got just the thing for you. Here's my kayak. You can take my kayak up. So in the span of 25, 30 minutes, I kayaked up Cranberry Brook. And, it was such a fantastic moment because I was going between all of the warehouses that satisfy all of our wanted now, consumer culture, Wayfair and Amazon and all these huge distribution warehouses on either side of Cranberry Brook in the forest. And then I came up to the Jersey Turnpike, and you could see all the trucks zooming by delivering all this stuff. And yet that river, goes back millennia. And when I was in the little museum in Cranberry, I had seen the axe heads and the spearheads and the things that they had dug up from encampments along that brook, that had been left behind by the indigenous population from thousands of years ago. So I was canoeing up a body of water that had really changed very little except for the quality of the water itself for all that time, while being surrounded by all these things that were very much of our particular historical moment. And that was it was really a fantastic experience all the way around. And, I was doing it with a certain amount of tongue-in-cheek kind of humor. I called it like I'm going up the Amazon to Amazonia and, all this kind of stuff. But it was great. And then when I got through to the other side, because I had said to Tim, the guy who lent me his kayak, I was like, okay, great, Tim, but what do I do when I get up there? Like, what do I do with your kayak? And he said, just leave it there. I'll come up and get it later in the day or tomorrow. It was one of those great acts of generosity, which I encountered a lot. If you're doing something fun out there, a little off the beaten track, people just take to it. They kind of want to be a part of it. They're like, wow, okay, this sounds fun. Okay, I'll lend you my kayak. That aspect of the walk I really loved.
Nothing except the water quality had changed. That's quite a statement.
Nature is just there lurking, ready to just reclaim all this stuff once we go by the wayside. And, at our current pace, it's not going to take that long. And that aspect of decay and vines and trees taking things back was something I was also really cognizant of the whole way. And there's nothing more kind of telling to the human condition than the kind of once grandiose tombstone that says, you, my dear beloved, will never be forgotten, and it's tumbled over and it's barely legible. It's these, the things that we build are not forever, and what will take them over in the end is going to be the same nature that we allow to flourish in different places, and it has the upper hand.
Okay, but what do you say to people that say that our land and now even the earth is overpopulated, to the neo-Malthusians who are concerned in the opposite direction?
I occupy a kind of funny place. I think maybe I'm not even remotely alone where, I love fellow mankind. I love so much of what we do and the way we entertain each other and the creativity that our, species shows. But I'm also very cognizant there's way too many of us. I mean, we just hit the 8 billion mark. I mean, in my lifetime, I was actually talking to a guy the other day that was like telling me about how he remembered when we got to the 4 billion mark. There are people that are on Earth right now that were here when there were only like 3.5 billion of us. I mean, it's absurd what's going on now. And if you're an environmentalist, you just have to face up to the fact that the worst thing for the globe environmentally is us, right? We're the ones that are doing the damage to it. So if you want to make the Earth a healthier, cleaner place, you should want fewer of us. Our attitude is we should be cleaner about the way we go about it, which we should definitely, but we're never going to be a good news story when it comes to the Earth, as long as we continue to grow at the pace that we are.
You talk about the Eastern State Penitentiary, and I learned something from your book that I had never realized, is that modern solitary confinement has its roots in Quaker silence.
The Eastern State Penitentiary, which goes back to the early 1830s, built by the Quakers, was really a pioneer in this very rigid solitary confinement. It was very much putting the penitence into the idea of penitentiary, that you would go there and you would be repentant, and you would face your sins, your crimes, as a solitary sort of praying individual. And that in itself was what drew Alexis de Tocqueville to come to the United States, which is one of the great ironies that one of the great writers of American democracy, and on the book he wrote, looking at the democratic experiment underway in the United States, actually came to the United States to study its penitentiaries and its prison system. And then as I went on in that experience, and in the chapter, I then write about going to a Quaker meeting house and experiencing this incredible light exhibit that was created by James Turrell, who's a famous light sort of sight artist of sorts. And it was basically a chapter about trying to find freedom in different forms, even trying to find some semblance of freedom in a prison setting, because they had kind of left these, what they called eye of God, these small windows in each of these cells.
You subtitled the book A Walk of Memory and Renewal. In light of some of the tensions we talked about, whether it's the privilege aspect, whether it's, how the Amish are separated and yet connected to us, whether it's the idea of overpopulation and the consequent Amazonias that produces. What are the memories and what renewal would you like to see, or would you like to leave us with?
I called it that in part because the memory stuff was really kind of exploring the concept of what it is that we remember, what it is that we decide to forget in our own personal stories, but particularly our national story. And I explore a lot the kind of buried things, the forgotten people. And, in that regard, I think it's really important for any of us to understand, particularly now we're at this time, huge argument about what we should teach in our schools and critical race theory and all this stuff, which is really quite maddening, that this is an incredibly difficult country to understand its past in a thorough way, but the more effort you give it, the more frustrating it becomes, but the richer it becomes. And, I now that we're at this point where a lot of people are trying to cast shame on those who cast shame on the country, I think there's great value in feeling shame for a place, because I think you only feel shame for a place that you also love, right? You don't feel shame for someone else's country. You feel shame for parts of your own nation's story. But that doesn't detract from the love that you can have for it at the same time. And I felt a lot of both those emotions as I went. And that, I guess, goes to the renewal part. I mean, in a lot of ways, it renewed my faith in the country, because it was very much about putting aside all these big things that we fight over and steam over when we're sitting in our houses looking at our computer screens or television screens. And I just wanted to go out and kind of make up my mind about the place just only based on what I was seeing day to day and the people I was meeting, those particulars, And in that regard, I had to come away pretty heartened by what I found. And just being on kind of the common ground that we share when you're with people of whatever persuasion, and spending that amount of time, length of time, whatever it was, with the people I met along the way, was just, it gave me a lot. It was warm, and it was fun. And, look, I watched a spring unfold as I had never watched a spring unfold. I walked the leaf line, essentially. I walked north as the leaves were blooming going north. And that experience, I'd never really fully understand how springs happen. And I'm not exactly a newborn, and yet that in itself was just really, it was its own form of renewal. And as you know from having read the book, I have various of these sort of rapturous moments that were this weird mingling of a kind of like joyful grief almost, which is a hard emotion to explain. And I even started wondering a little bit about, do we all have these moments? I assume we all do, where you're just overcome by this sense of joy for just being in a place at a given moment, and you don't know quite what to make of it, And there was a lot of renewal in that. And, going back to my original thing about we all have front doors, just please go out your front door and have your own sort of self-guided ramble. I couldn't recommend it more highly. And do it over several days if you can. Do it over a week, do it over 2 weeks, because the longer you do it, the more the rhythm of it builds, and the more this stuff sort of seeps into your spirit and the way that you look at things. And this aspect of just paying attention, I think is my main thing, my main personal takeaway, but also my main prompting to anybody listening, is to just go and spend some time just paying attention to the world that we live in, and not being distracted by the things on your phone or the flickerings that are demanding our attention that are kind of fake, It's well, I could ramble. Speaking of rambling, I could ramble on. But you just read what happened in the 19th century when all the great experiments, all the great realizations were made about, the breakthroughs that Darwin, just take somebody like Charles Darwin made. I mean, Darwin made these breakthroughs that he did just by noticing things, just by paying attention when he's in the Galapagos to the different types of finches and the different types of turtles. And it was all just deliberate noticing. And there's so much to be gained by just paying attention to the small things, and making something of them. And that's a lot of what this walk was built on.
Neil King, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I hope you'll ramble on.
I will definitely ramble on. We'll have to do a ramble at one point too. Sunil, thank you. It was a pleasure.
My shoulders until my head stops spinning round, real to real. I can feel it. Let them all in and the stars are falling. Put your head on my shoulder until my heart beats out of my chest. I can't feel the rest, and no one knows what.
You are listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Neil King Jr., who walked 26 days covering 330 miles between Washington, D.C. and New York City? First, at a time of social and political upheaval, finding a way to return to the land, whether by tilling it, preserving it, and in Neil King's case, walking it, can be a healing and even joyous experience. King comes through an almost spiritual journey, optimistic about the prospects of American life, when the story of its decline is what might tie conservatives and liberals together in public discourse. IRL is a social media abbreviation for in real life, a line that separates two halves of us. In King's telling, at least what we see in the IRL half is vastly different from what we see in the other half of life, which is run by the flickering light on our screens. Come to think of it, what an oxymoron the term virtual reality is. Question is, in the fast-paced modern American lifestyle, can a ramble be more than just an oxymoron? Second, in the book, King walks through Lancaster, Pennsylvania, home to the Amish and Mennonites, the Anabaptist groups that separate themselves socially from the rest of society while participating in the mainstream marketplace where their goods command revenue and profits. Lots of groups have wanted this deal. But if this kind of separation or looking away was widely allowed and admired, we would have to be okay with many things we do not accept in integrated and interdependent communities. The balance between our social and economic needs is neither obvious nor static. The Anabaptists might have been less economically integrated in an earlier age when their social norms were tolerated less by mainstream society. Now, we celebrate their uniqueness and enjoy very much their many cheeses. Third, if you can, take your ramble. Watch spring unfold or the fall die in winter hush. Go to the islands on the mighty Susquehanna to touch the ancient rock etchings to know that life will continue. Many years ago, I touched the stones that 3,000 years ago made up the walls of the city of David, now in modern Jerusalem. And I felt the electricity of history pass through my hands. King felt the same way on the Susquehanna. I bet you will too. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Ammonite, a DC rock trio. The songs come from their album Demolitions. Aaron Frisbee on vocals and guitar, Selena Benally on lead guitar, and Alison Sina on drums. You can find them on their Bandcamp channel. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please sign up for updates at our new website, ihppod.org, or email us at ihppod@gmail.com. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.